Somewhere on the internet right now, there are thousands of thirst trap fan edits of notorious criminal Jeffrey Dahmer. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? It's not the real Jeffrey Dahmer, it's from the Netflix show Monsters. Well, when you open the comments up and see things like Jeff is my biggest crush and even AI generated photos of people posing with him like he's a boyfriend, you start to realize that maybe the line between fantasy and reality doesn't exist anymore. It's like people forgot these were real crimes with real victims and not just another TikTok trend. For anyone that doesn't know what I'm talking about, Monsters is Ryan Murphy's true crime anthology series where each season focuses on a different real-life killer, Dahmer, the Menendez brothers, and most recently, Ed Gein, which I, as well as millions of other people, tuned in to watch this newest release, and oh boy is it controversial. This season has taken one of the most disturbing real-life cases in American history and basically turned it into a high-budget horror. It's way more disturbing than Dahmer and Menendez combined. But the problem I have with it is that 80% of it is just completely made up lies. Monsters claims to tell real stories, but episode after episode it changes the facts, rewrites events, and even completely makes up victims. And of course they hire an attractive man to play the role because you can't have a Monsters season without half the internet thirsting over the killer. And every time Ryan Murphy swears it's not about glorifying them, it's about understanding them. But somehow by episode 2, half the internet is calling them misunderstood icons and the other half is begging Netflix to stop. So in this video, I want to dig deep into what Monsters keeps getting wrong, why it's so controversial every single season, and whether shows like this should even exist in the first place. Because when real life horror becomes something to binge, you have to ask, who's the real monster here? Before we dissect Netflix's latest controversy, we need to talk about the bigger issue at hand. The internet's bizarre history of romanticizing serial killers. I know, it sounds almost unbelievable. Why would anyone idolize some of the worst people imaginable? But if you spend enough time scrolling online, you'll eventually stumble into this weird corner of the internet filled with fan pages, threads, and TikTok edits dedicated to actual murderers. Crazy, I know. But what if I told you that this isn't exactly new, that even decades ago serial killers had their own die-hard fan clubs. Ted Bundy, who ended the life of over 30 women, famously had female fans flocking to his 1979 trial, passing him love notes and marriage proposals. Some women even styled their hair to look like his victims as some sick way to get his attention. Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker, received hundreds of love letters in prison and actually got married to one of his admirers on death row. Even the real-life Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17 young men, got fan mail after his arrest. So yeah, this obsession with serial killers isn't new. It's been around for decades, but then the internet came along and everything just went up to a whole nother level. And just like that, a bunch of disturbed strangers could bond online behind their anonymous profiles. What could possibly go wrong? Well, apparently everything. People were making thirst trap edits and even writing fan fiction about real events. True crime has become so desensitized online that there are even serial killer coloring books on Amazon and no one sees a problem with it.
If you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, who would it be? I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer's pretty fascinating. I think I would have loved to have met him. I was infatuated with serial killers when I was younger.
So if you're like me, then you may be thinking, what the heck is wrong with these people? Well, psychologists actually have a term for it, and it's called hybristophilia, an attraction to someone who's committed terrible crimes. It's been linked to everything from low self-esteem to the thrill of danger. Think of it like a celebrity crush, but for people who need serious help. And before you ask, I'm not talking about the people who are fascinated with true crimes and watch documentaries, because that's just morbid curiosity. I'm talking about the people who romanticize these killers and paint them as just being misunderstood. I'm sorry, but if you truly believe that a serial killer just needed a hug, then maybe it's time to log off. But just when you think that people couldn't glamorize serial killers anymore, Netflix dropped Monsters, the show that turned some of the darkest crimes in American history into the internet's new obsession. But did Netflix go too far, or are the audiences the ones to blame? Because once you hear the truth behind this show, you will not look at it the same way again. So let's start at the beginning with Netflix's release of Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Now, when I first heard about this, I won't lie, I had mixed feelings. Sure, I understand why people love true crime and the psychology behind it, but do we really need another Dahmer retelling? Haven't we dissected this man enough? But then the show's creator, Ryan Murphy, came out and said, "This time it's different. We're centering the victims, we're exposing the system that let him keep killing." Which, yeah, okay, but this is also the same man who created Glee, so safe to say I was a little bit skeptical. The show jumps back and forth through Dahmer's life, the childhood red flags everyone ignored, the lonely weird kid dissecting roadkill, his teenage years and how they spiraled out of control, and all the horrors that followed after. Now, I won't go into detail about any of his crimes, but let's just say he was an incredibly disturbed man. It doesn't shy away from it either. It shows all his crimes in the most confronting and disturbing ways possible. It also showed us the perspective around Dahmer. A big part of the series focuses on his neighbor Glenda Cleveland, who would constantly smell awful odors and heard screaming from Dahmer's apartment. And every time she tried to alert the police about these issues, she was consistently ignored and not believed. The show makes it pretty obvious that Dahmer got away with what he did because of who he was and who he targeted. Most of his victims were young gay men of color, and he was a quiet, awkward white guy, so the police just ignored every warning that could have stopped him way earlier. There's one episode which is almost entirely dedicated to one of his victims, Tony Hughes, a deaf black man who Dahmer befriended and killed. It humanized Tony in a way that true crime stories rarely do, showing his life, his hopes, and even his family before he was taken. For once, I actually felt like a show cared about who was killed and not just who killed him. But then I discovered that Netflix didn't even bother to contact Tony's family.
A new series about Dahmer briefly portrays Tony Hughes' life after the family moved to Wisconsin. Tony's mother, Shirley Hughes, says nobody at Netflix reached out beforehand, and the family's now reliving the trauma from his murder again.
When can we just let him rest? We want to rest.
So Netflix did all this talk about centering the victims, and yet all it did was just re-traumatize every single living family member of those victims, because Tony's family weren't the only ones not contacted. Rita Isbell, the sister of Dahmer's victim Errol Lindsay, also woke up one morning to see that the show recreated her gut-wrenching courtroom outburst where she screams at Dahmer and had to be restrained. Imagine that, the worst day of your life reenacted on Netflix for millions of people to see, word for word, from your outfit to your hairstyle, and no one told you? No one asked, they just did it. Of course, Ryan Murphy defended himself and said that he reached out to over 20 family members but didn't get a response.
31 years ago, the time has passed, so I was kind of dealing with it. But since the movie came out and the way he told the movie and showed the movie and lied about him contacting us, he didn't contact none of us. And he said that he did, Ryan Murphy.
He did not contact you or anyone in your family?
No.
But despite all the backlash, it became a huge hit, and it's one of Netflix's most watched series of all time. The actor who played Dahmer, Evan Peters, won awards, critics loved it, and the internet, as always, lost its mind in every way possible. On one side, you had people saying, this is art, it's exposing systemic racism, homophobia, and the police failures that let this happen. And then on the other side, you had people, and I wish I was joking, thirsting over Jeffrey Dahmer. Not just over the actor, but over the actual killer. I literally saw comments that said stuff like, he just needed love, you could tell that he felt so guilty. Girl, he literally ate people for lunch. There is no misunderstood here. But I feel like this is one of the biggest issues with the show because it unintentionally or intentionally feeds into this growing issue online. I mean, hello, not only do they dramatize the story, but they cast these charismatic, attractive actors to play the killers. Of course, sick people on TikTok are gonna romanticize the hell out of it. I think what makes it worse is how disconnected the internet is from reality. Every single day, our feeds are flooded with all these horrific stories stories, and it's gotten to the point where people are just completely desensitized to it. So when a real story like this gets turned into a TV show, people forget that it's not fiction. These were real lives, real victims, and yet somehow he ended up as a trending Halloween costume. But guess what? Literally none of that matters because the show was a hit, and you know what that means. Season 2. But this time it was focusing on a new set of killers, the Menendez brothers. Now at first I was a little confused because this case seemed like a weird one for a show called Monsters. They weren't serial killers, they were two rich kids from Beverly Hills who in 1989 killed their parents and then went on a shopping spree with their inheritance. When they were first arrested, everyone thought the same thing. Oh, these are just spoiled brats who didn't want to wait for their trust fund. But when the trial came along, that narrative flipped. Suddenly, the world was watching Lyle and Eric Menendez sobbing on national TV, alleging years of sexual and physical abuse from their father, whilst their mother looked the other way. At the time, the public didn't know what to believe. Some saw them as manipulative liars just trying to save themselves, and others saw them as genuine victims too. However, the court clearly didn't care, and both brothers were sentenced to life in prison without parole. It honestly made me really curious to see how the show was going to play out, because if Dahmer got called out for not being sensitive enough to the victims, what happens when the killers themselves say that they are the victims? Because that's complicated. The first few episodes of the show almost trick you. They play out like this rich kid fantasy with all this money and arrogance. You see Lyle and Eric strutting around Beverly Hills, and as a viewer, you're meant to, I guess, dislike them in a way. But then the story suddenly shifts and you get flashbacks of what was allegedly going on behind closed doors. The father, Jose Menendez, gets revealed as this monster, and the mother, Kitty, is portrayed as a fragile, complicit woman. There's one episode and it's basically all flashbacks of Eric as a kid, and I'm not gonna lie, it is so uncomfortable to watch. And for a moment, you actually feel your entire perspective start to bend. You start to think, oh my gosh, maybe this wasn't greed, maybe it was survival. And that's what the series does well. It's not that it takes sides, but it definitely wants you to sympathize with the brothers. It raises the question of, if the abuse was real, does it justify the murder? Were there other options? Would they have been killed by their parents if they didn't act first, as they claim to have believed? The show wants you to think about the case from all angles. But then, because the show can't go one season without making people furious, the real Menendez family spoke up, and they went off. Within days of the release, multiple relatives released statements basically saying that the show was full of lies. Like, not exaggerated, straight up lies. They accused Netflix of twisting facts, ignoring new evidence, and inventing details that never happened. One of the biggest lies being how the show hinted at a sexual relationship between Lyle and Eric. And I don't mean in a subtle, maybe you missed it type of way. I mean, they literally included a kiss, a dreamlike shower scene, and a handful of moments that were filmed in this weird suggestive way that makes you go, wait, are they actually saying what I think they're saying? But the thing is, that storyline is complete lies, all of it. In the real trial, neither brother claimed that they ever had any sexual relationship with each other. What they actually testified about was the alleged abuse that they endured from their father. Eric said that when he was about 5 years old, that Lyle had once hurt him with a toothbrush, something he described as a product of the environment that they were raised in, because Eric has said that his father did the same thing to him. So no, it wasn't a relationship, it was the trauma of being abused and having no concept of what normal is. But the show twists that into this weird, provocative, taboo thing, which is exactly what Ryan Murphy is known for, by the way. His excuse for it was that there are people who say that it never happened and that there were people who said it did. But Ryan knew that that was all outside gossip and made up rumors. I personally think it's really strange to create this sexual fanfiction based on literal trauma. Eric Menendez released a statement from prison calling the show dishonest and filled with horrible lies. And yeah, as you can probably guess, Ryan had no contact with the family, but it's not that he reached out and no one replied, he never contacted them in the first place. He came out and said that he had no interest in talking to the brothers or the family beforehand, not even just to say that the show was happening. They found out the same way that we all did when the trailer dropped. dropped. Can you imagine finding out that Netflix was dropping a 10-episode series about your family's worst nightmare through a trailer? But Ryan didn't care about how the family felt. He came out and defended the show, saying that the outrage was fake and the show is the best thing that happened to the Menendez brothers in 30 years. Which is such a bold and crazy statement to make. I can understand where he's coming from in the sense that the show brought so much awareness to the case again that people online were now debating whether the brothers were victims or villains, and that's a good conversation to have. But his response to the family's outrage just shows me that his intention with the show never was to help, it was to exploit. Because again, they casted two good-looking guys as the lead, and suddenly it's like the internet forgets they're real people. You have the thirst trap edits of the show, you have people dressing up as them on Halloween. The internet just can't take anything seriously, and the family having to be a non-consenting witness to that is just crazy. But controversy or not, it did what Netflix wanted it to do. It got people talking, and once again, it got people angry. But I guess that's the formula now. Shock, outrage, profit, and repeat. Because no matter how messy, controversy sells, and they know that they can just keep upping the stakes. Which brings me to the most recent season of Monsters, the Ed Gein Story. Now, Ed Gein was definitely an interesting one to do because he's not as mainstream as the rest of them, but although you don't know his name, you do know his influence. Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, Leatherface, they were all inspired by Ed's story. He was basically the blueprint of horror. It's important to note that Ed was diagnosed with schizophrenia later in his life, so he's not legally held responsible for his crimes. He also wasn't even technically a serial killer. He was a grave robber who was only ever convicted of 2 murders. But what police found in that farmhouse in 1957 basically rewired pop culture. I can't really describe much of it on YouTube, but basically he was turning people into furniture and even into suits that he would wear. I'll leave that one to your imagination. Let me just start this by saying, when a show comes out and describes itself as a very sincere exploration of the human condition, yeah, that's usually code for we're about to make you weirdly sympathize with a murderer. They cast yet another attractive, ripped man for the role, Charlie Hunnam, and to his credit, I think he did a really good job. Aside from that strange high-pitched voice that sounded nothing like the real guy.
Don't mean nothing by it. Just wanted to welcome her to town is all.
He played him in this soft, childlike type of way, like he's constantly trying to pretend that he's not violent. His mother plays a huge role in the show, and we learn that she's a crazy religious freak who obviously caused Ed a lot of psychological damage growing up. I think my main issue with doing the Ed Gein story was that a lot of his stuff was just folklore, meaning that no one actually had solid proof of what went on. Like I said before, he only has 2 real documented kills, so when Netflix saw this, they thought, that's not binge-worthy enough, let's give him a few more. For example, there's a scene where he revs up a chainsaw and unalives these 2 random hunters in the woods. It's extreme, it's dramatic, and it's all completely fake. In real life, yes, there was 2 men from Wisconsin who went missing in the 50s, but there was no proof tying them to Ed. Then there's the Evelyn Hartley storyline, which, by the way, is maybe the most uncomfortable thing the show does. I'm not gonna go into details, but essentially we see Ed kidnap and unalive her in a very disturbing way. But the issue is, again, that this never happened. Yes, Evelyn was a real 15-year-old babysitter, but she had no connection to Ed. In real life, she vanished from her home in 1953, and the case went unsolved. So Ryan Murphy took this real-life missing girl and turned her into one of Ed's victims. For what? Entertainment value? Imagine being Evelyn's family watching that. Your loved one's real disappearance rewritten for horror entertainment. It's disrespectful and outrageously cruel. And it doesn't stop there. The show even throws in the idea that Ed unalived his own brother Henry. There's a scene where Henry tries to leave their twisted home, and Ed, like some jealous mama's boy from hell, took Henry's life to protect their mother. In the show, he then started a fire and acted like that was the way that Henry died. The real-life Henry did die in a fire, but there was nothing connecting it to Ed. There were some rumors later that that maybe Ed was involved because of, you know, his other crimes, but nothing was ever confirmed. Again, Netflix just saw this as another source of entertainment. As if making up fake murders wasn't enough, the show also invents relationships out of thin air. Take Adeline Watkins, for example. In the show, she's basically Ed's partner in crime who encourages his impulses, shares his obsessions, and it even depicts her as the one who tells him to participate in certain twisted acts. But every single detail of this is complete lies. Yes, there was a real woman named Adeline Watkins who knew Ed in real life, but they never had a relationship. Years ago, Adeline came out and said that they went out on a couple of dates, but she never even stepped foot in his house. But for some reason, Netflix took a look at that interview and decided, let's make her a main character. So now, in Monster, Adeline isn't just some local woman who met Ed once, she's basically his psychotic soulmate. I mean, talk about an assassination of character. And then we get to the most disrespectful fabrication of all, Bernice Warden, who was Ed's real victim. In real life, Bernice was a 58-year-old hardware store owner who Ed unalived during what was either a robbery or a psychotic episode. He bought something from the store, left, came back, and unalived her. That is it. But in Monster, they decided to add depth. So now, Bernice isn't just a victim, she's Ed's lover. In the show, they flirt, they sleep together, and it's implied that his motive to end her life comes from him thinking that she's not pure, which is just gross. There is no evidence that they ever had any kind of relationship. Ed Gein even told officers that he never had a sexual experience in his life. It would be different if the real Ed had hallucinated it and told police that's what happened, but the fact that it's completely fabricated is just mind-blowing. What makes it so much worse is that Bernice's real son was the town deputy who helped investigate her murder. Imagine being him and seeing Netflix turn your mum's murder into this weird, twisted romance subplot. And that's the thing, every time Monster tries to humanize or add emotion, it ends up just coming across as pure exploitation. It's rewriting history to fit a TV formula. And the worst part, millions of people will come away from it thinking that that's actually what happened. And I've heard so many people defend the show saying it's not a documentary, it's a drama, but where in the show does it say that? The title is literally called Monsters, the Ed Gein Story. It would never cross your mind that 80% of it is fabricated. Something I kept coming back to when watching the show was just how desperately it wanted you to feel bad for him. We see his bad upbringing, we see his isolation, we see how he was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the end. And I get the point is to show how monsters are made, but at what point is it too much? Because sure, you can acknowledge that Ed Gein was mentally ill. You can even have compassion for the miserable, isolated life that he lived. But compassion doesn't erase what he did, and this is where the show completely loses the plot, both literally and morally. It spends 10 episodes peeling back the layers of Ed's trauma, showing how his mother's religious control twisted his mind, how he was failed by society, how he didn't mean to be a monster, but it barely spends a second for the people he destroyed. And that is the problem with humanizing the villain too much. It dehumanizes the victims. Because whilst Ed Gein gets empathy, what do they get? Their story completely fabricated and lied about. I just think it's beyond wrong, and the reactions I've seen online just completely prove my point. There's TikToks of people crying over him, saying he seemed like such a kind and gentle man. Sorry? A kind and gentle man? Did we forget about how he turned one of his victims into a literal lampshade? On top of this, all I can think about is how Monsters managed to humanize Ed Gein more than the Menendez brothers. I have literally seen people make cakes out of Ed's creations, and it is so disturbing that I can't even show it. Not only that, I've seen people make nail art out of the show, with one nail even depicting Ed's box filled with a certain body part. And no one in the comments sees an issue with it. And that is my problem with the show. It feeds into this desensitized culture online, and people forget that these are real crimes with real victims. And I'm not saying we should dehumanize him either. He wasn't some supernatural demon, he was a man, which makes it even scarier. But there is a difference between understanding someone and sympathizing with them. Understanding means learning how his brain worked. It's about recognizing the conditions that create monsters so we can prevent more. Sympathy reality, though, is when you start feeling sorry for him, and that is where this kind of storytelling crosses the line. Because when you start feeling sorry for Ed, you stop feeling sorry for everyone he destroyed. And honestly, I just keep asking myself, what is the point? What's the point in trying to humanize a murderer? Because if it's about empathy, why isn't that empathy extended to the people who were killed or their families? Is the goal to make us think critically or just to make us feel something, no matter who gets erased in the process? And honestly, do you want to know what the most ironic part of all of this is? Is that the actor who plays Ed Gein seems to also miss the point. Charlie Hunnam actually said, and this is a real quote, "Who was the monster? This poor boy who was abused his whole life and then left in total isolation, suffering from undiagnosed mental illness. Or the legion of people who sensationalized his life for entertainment and arguably darkened the American psyche in the process." Now, on paper, that sounds deep, right? Like, oh, look at us, we're questioning society's role in creating monsters. But listen to that again slowly. This man is literally promoting a Netflix show that is sensationalizing Ed's life for entertainment, while asking us about the morality of sensationalizing Ed's life for entertainment. It's like setting your house on fire and then giving a TED talk about arson. It's almost impressive how self-contradictory it is. Because yes, he's right, Ed Gein was mentally ill, he was isolated, he was deeply broken. And yes, the media definitely exploited his story for decades, but this show isn't some noble act of cultural reflection. It's a big budget horror drama that shows his crimes in the most glorifying, disturbing, and unnecessary ways that I actually had to stop watching after a few episodes. I physically couldn't stomach it. So yeah, no, this whole flip it around and blame it on society angle is just so shallow. You can't ask us to reflect on the dangers of sensationalism when you're literally sensationalizing murder. You cannot hold up a mirror to society if you're standing in front of it posing for an Emmy, and I can't stress that enough. The truth is, that quote seems to sum up everything wrong with this series. Because yes, it wants us to think, it wants us to feel guilty for watching, but it also wants us to keep watching. And honestly, that's the core of it. Monster keeps asking who's the real villain, whilst refusing to admit that it plays a huge part in the answer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've seen the show, please let me know what you think in the comments. I cannot wait to read all your different opinions, and I'm also going to leave some links to the real stories in the description, so if you're interested, go and check those real stories out. And if you made it this far, please comment the word fire so I can see everyone who doesn't have short attention spans and I can like your comments. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for all the support, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!